France versus Russia. Who really controls Europe in 2026? You have heard the hot takes. France is Europe's only nuclear power inside the European Union. Russia is the continent's biggest war economy and the most feared military threat on the map. So here is the real question. In 2026, who is actually shaping Europe's decisions, its security posture, and its future? In the next 20 minutes, we are going to define what control even means. Then, we are going to stress test France and Russia across the only arenas that matter: military power, economic leverage, energy, alliances, influence operations, and political decision-making. And by the end, you will see why the most common answers are usually wrong. Let's get straight to it. When people say controls Europe, they often mean one of three things, and you need to pick one before the debate even makes sense. First is hard power control. Who can physically protect Europe or threaten it, fast, at scale, with credible escalation? Second is institutional control. Who can shape rules, coalitions, and collective choices, the boring stuff that quietly decides what Europe does and does not do. Third is psychological control. Who makes European leaders feel pressured, divided, distracted, or risk-averse? If you judge by hard power alone, Russia looks huge. If you judge by institutions alone, Russia looks boxed out. If you judge by psychology, it gets complicated because fear can be more powerful than tanks. So let's start with the cold numbers, because the numbers set the ceiling for everything else. In 2024, Russia's military spending jumped to an estimated $149 billion, about 7.1% of its GDP, according to SIPRI's military expenditure assessment. And SIPRI's work on Russia's 2025 budget estimates Russia's total planned military spending at about 15.5 trillion rubles. Again, roughly 7.2% of GDP despite reduced transparency. That is not normal peacetime spending. That is an economy and a state organized around sustained war. France is not trying to match that kind of mobilization. France's approach is structured, programmed, and long-term. The French military programming law sets a path of major increases through 2030, and the headline number that gets cited is 413 billion euros for 2024 to 2030, announced as the total plan for that period. Already, you can see the first trap in this debate. Russia's spending is concentrated and urgent, driven by wartime production and losses. France's spending is planned modernization across the services, spread across years, inside a democracy, under fiscal constraints. Those are two different machines. Now let's talk nuclear, because in Europe, nuclear credibility is the ultimate backstop. France's nuclear stockpile is estimated at about 290 warheads as of January 2024, according to SIPRI's yearbook coverage of French nuclear forces. Russia's total nuclear inventory is far larger. SIPRI has estimated Russia's total inventory in the thousands, with an overall estimate around 5,580 warheads in its World Nuclear Forces reporting, and a military stockpile estimate around 4,380 warheads in its Russian Nuclear Forces section, depending on what is being counted in each figure. So, if you are only counting nuclear weight, Russia is the heavyweight and France is the agile, elite fighter with a smaller but still decisive arsenal. France cannot outnumber Russia. France does not need to. What France needs is the ability to impose unacceptable costs on any attacker. That is deterrence. And the reason this matters for control is simple. The country that can credibly deter escalation can shape how far everyone else is willing to go. But Europe is not just France and Russia in a vacuum. Europe is alliances. NATO is the main structure for collective defense. And by 2024, NATO had 32 member countries, after Sweden joined in March 2024 and Finland in April 2023, according to NATO and official government summaries. France is inside NATO, Russia is not. This is a massive asymmetry in institutional control. And if we widen from NATO to the European Union's own defense ambitions, the EU's strategic compass aims to build an EU rapid deployment capacity of up to 5,000 troops, according to the European External Action Service. That is not a continental army, but it is a signal. Europe is trying to become harder to coerce. So here is the first major conclusion, grounded in structure, not vibes. Russia has far greater capacity to threaten Europe militarily at the high end, and it spends like a wartime state. France has far greater capacity to shape Europe through alliances and institutions, and it is integrated into the networks that actually make Europe move. Now let's step into the arena that used to be Russia's strongest lever: energy. For years, Russia's ability to supply gas to Europe was a form of strategic gravity, not a magic wand, but a lever. That lever is weaker now. The Council of the European Union explains that Russia's share of EU pipeline gas imports dropped from over 40% in 2021 to about 11% in 2024. And for pipeline gas plus LNG combined, Russia was under 19% of total EU gas imports in 2024. Concilium. The European Commission has framed the broader effort through Repower EU, noting sharp drops in Russian fossil fuel imports and stating an ambition to end dependence, including the goal of phasing out Russian fossil fuels. Then, you have the latest operational reality. Reuters reported on December 30th, 2025, that Russia's pipeline gas exports to Europe fell sharply again in 2025, tied to the end of the transit agreement via Ukraine and the closure of that route, with Turkstream as a remaining major pipeline path. So the energy control story has flipped. Russia can still hurt specific countries and still earns money, including through LNG flows. But the broad dependency that once gave Moscow a seat at Europe's kitchen table has been reduced. My opinion, and I will label it clearly as opinion, is that this is one of the most underappreciated changes in Europe's strategic landscape. When a coercion tool weakens, it does not just reduce pressure, it changes Europe's psychology. Leaders take risks they would not take when the heating switch could be flipped by someone else. Now let's talk economics, because control is also about who has the larger engine. France is a major economy inside the EU, and Russia is a major economy relative to its region, but the scale is different. The World Bank lists France's 2024 GDP at about $3.16 trillion in current terms. The IMF data profile for Russia shows GDP in current prices around $2.54 trillion, depending on year and estimate, again in current terms. And the EU as a whole is the giant in the room. Eurostat tracks EU GDP growth and output, and even without getting lost in methodology, the point is that Europe's total economic base, the EU plus close partners like the UK and Norway, far exceeds Russia's. So why does Russia still feel so heavy? Because control is not just total GDP. It is how much of your GDP you are willing to burn for strategic outcomes, and whether your political system can sustain pain without changing course. Russia, as shown by its very high defense burden, has been willing to trade long-term civilian prosperity for near-term military output. That kind of trade is harder for democracies. Not impossible, but harder. And that brings us to the heart of the France versus Russia question. What kind of power moves Europe in 2026? If you want the simplest model, here it is. France's influence is mostly opt-in. It persuades, brokers, organizes coalitions, and uses legitimacy and institutions. Russia's influence is mostly opt-out. It pressures, threatens, disrupts, and weaponizes uncertainty. Both can shape outcomes, but they do it differently, and the results look different on the map. Let's zoom in on military reality in Europe right now, because this is where the YouTube comments usually explode. Russia's land warfare capacity has been tested brutally in Ukraine. It has also adapted. You can argue about quality, but you cannot argue that Russia has not scaled production and learned hard lessons. That is exactly what sustained spending and industrial focus produces, and CIPRI's spending figures are a proxy for that momentum. France, meanwhile, is not trying to fight a continental land war alone. France's military value is high-end capability, expeditionary reach, nuclear deterrence, and leadership in coalition operations. France maintains a full-spectrum force, including a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier and sea-based deterrent. I am not going to throw random platform counts at you from low-quality lists because you asked for factual sourcing. What I can say with solid sourcing is that France's armed forces are around 200,000 active personnel, according to reporting in late 2025, and France has been openly discussing expanding reservists and strengthening national resilience. So the military comparison is not Russia versus France in isolation. It is Russia versus a NATO Europe that is rearming unevenly but clearly. This is where the narrative, who controls Europe, becomes more like who sets Europe's agenda. On that point, Russia has achieved something real. It has forced Europe to reprioritize defense, energy security, and industrial resilience. That is agenda setting through threat. It is a kind of control, but it is negative control. Russia cannot force Europe to love it, but Russia can force Europe to react to it. France has achieved something different. France tries to set Europe's agenda proactively, especially around strategic autonomy, European defense industrial capacity, and the idea that Europe should be able to act even if the United States is distracted. You can see this tension across European debates, and it shows up even in reporting about individual countries raising spending targets. For example, Associated Press reported Lithuania planning to boost defense spending to 5 to 6% of GDP starting in 2026, explicitly citing Russian threat perceptions. That is Russia setting the security agenda indirectly through fear. But that does not mean Russia is controlling Europe's choices. It means Russia is influencing the constraints under which Europe chooses. Now we have to confront the institutional layer, because this is where France has a unique position that is often overlooked in military niche debates. France is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, alongside the United States, the UK, China, and Russia, as stated by the UN and France's foreign ministry. That gives France global diplomatic weight, veto power, and a kind of legitimacy that most European states do not have. Russia has that seat too. So in the UN system, France and Russia are peers in formal status. But inside Europe's actual day-to-day decision engine, Russia is not in the room. France is. France votes in the EU. France shapes EU sanctions policy. France influences EU defense initiatives. France is part of NATO, nuclear planning culture, and allied deterrence. Russia is the external pressure shaping the room from outside. So if control means writing the rules, Russia is not controlling Europe. If control means making Europe feel constrained, Russia has meaningful control. Let's shift to the battlefield you cannot see on a map: information and political influence. This is the space where Russia has historically tried to compensate for economic and alliance disadvantages. The goal is not always to make Europe pro-Russia. The goal is often to make Europe unsure, divided, and tired. Uncertainty is a weapon because it slows collective action. I am going to keep this part careful and within YouTube guidelines, because I am not here to accuse specific domestic groups or push conspiracy narratives. The safe, grounded point is this: European governments and security services have repeatedly warned about foreign interference and disinformation risks over the past decade, and after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, those warnings intensified. That is the environment in which Europe operates in 2026. My opinion here is that Russia's most effective control tool is not propaganda that convinces everyone. It is pressure that increases the political cost of unity. It raises the price of doing hard things like sustained defense spending, sanctions endurance, and long-term support for Ukraine. Now, France's counterweight in this space is political leadership plus credible defense. France can speak with authority, coordinate with EU partners, and push collective policy. But France cannot single-handedly eliminate disinformation risk across a continent. Nobody can. So the real question becomes, which system is more resilient in 2026, Europe's coalition model or Russia's coercion model? To answer that, let's run 2026 scenarios that military planners actually care about. Scenario 1 is deterrence holds, and the war in Ukraine remains contained without a wider NATO-Russia clash. In this world, Russia continues to be dangerous, but Europe continues to harden. Defense budgets keep rising, energy dependence continues falling, and Europe's industry slowly expands capacity. Russia still influences Europe, but mostly by being the reason Europe invests in itself. Scenario 2 is escalation pressure, not necessarily direct war with NATO, but sustained hybrid disruptions in the Baltic region, cyber pressure, sabotage scares, and political intimidation. In this world, Russia's psychological leverage increases, and European cohesion gets stress-tested. You saw hints of this context in reporting about concerns over undersea infrastructure incidents and NATO presence in the Baltic, with countries like Sweden contributing to reinforced presence after joining NATO. The more Europe feels vulnerable, the more cautious it can become. Scenario 3 is strategic divergence inside Europe, where different capitals prioritize different threats, budgets, and political coalitions. In this world, Russia's relative power grows, not because Russia gets stronger, but because Europe's unity gets weaker. In all three scenarios, France matters, but not as a solo controller. France is a force multiplier for European action. It can push, broker, and occasionally unblock, and it provides something priceless, a European nuclear deterrent that is not dependent on Washington. Russia matters as the threat that sets the tempo. Russia can speed up Europe's defense transformation by scaring it into action, or it can slow Europe down by raising the costs of unity. Now let's answer the title honestly. Who really controls Europe in 2026? If by control, you mean who can invade and terrify, Russia has the sharper stick. Russia's wartime defense spending levels underline that it is committed to military power at a scale no single European state is matching. If by control you mean who can decide Europe's laws, budgets, sanctions, defense initiatives, and alliances, Russia does not control Europe. Europe controls Europe. France is one of the key players inside that system, and its institutional weight, military credibility, and nuclear status give it outsized influence among European states. If by control you mean who sets Europe's agenda, Russia has forced the agenda towards security, resilience, and defense. That is a real effect. But it is not stable control, because the more Russia pushes, the more Europe adapts, reduces dependency, and rearms. So my bottom line opinion, stated plainly, is this. Russia does not control Europe in 2026. Russia pressures Europe. France does not control Europe in 2026. France leads inside Europe, sometimes effectively, sometimes not, depending on whether other capitals follow. And the true deciding factor for control is not Paris versus Moscow. It is whether Europe stays cohesive enough to turn its larger economic base into sustained military readiness, and whether Russia can keep Europe politically fragmented long enough to exploit gaps. That is the contest. Now, before we close, here is the one question I want you to carry forward, because it cuts through the noise. When you see a headline about France or Russia controlling Europe, ask, are we talking about forcing choices or shaping choices? Forcing choices is coercion. Russia can do that in limited ways, especially near its borders, through threat and disruption. Shaping choices is leadership. France can do that in limited ways, especially when it aligns with Germany, the UK, and the frontline states, and when the EU and NATO are moving in the same direction. In 2026, Europe is not a chessboard owned by one king. It is a coalition under pressure, adapting in real time. And that is why the most honest answer to this whole debate is not a country name. The most honest answer is a dynamic.